You know, like I said, anytime between 7 and 7:30, sometimes as late as 8, but if it's 8, I'll try and like do a quick little mini stream first before to let you know. But between 7 and 7:30, aiming for 7. Tonight was not that night. So, for those of you just joining in, I'm currently reading my dad's manuscripts and doing live editing while I'm reading them to you. Now, it's my first time reading through any of these. I don't know what they're about or anything like that. So it's a complete mystery. So, without further ado, I'm going to start in on, and I'm currently reading right now, Stonecaller, and tonight is chapter 2. So, here goes. Chapter 2. The trip was an easy one. There was a well-traveled trail. The sky was fair, only an occasional cloud in sight, and the grass and wildflowers provided their illusion of peace and tranquility. Along the way, Quedrum took a couple of rabbits with his sling. Not even bothering with the special stones. Each time, Shapakalish accompanied him off the trail to pick the rabbits up. For our supper? He asked the first time. If we wish. If not, I'm sure I could sell it for a couple of coppers in the town. After the second rabbit, Shapakalish's comment was, "Very accurate with that sling of yours." Yes, back in the Arndal Hills where I came from, we start with the sling as soon as we start walking. I'm one of the best. The little man looked up at him. You are you? Quedrum shrugged. Think me a braggart if you wish. I am quite good with the sling. And you aren't giving me a chance to put a little distance between the two of us so I might crack you on the head with a stone, are you? He thought to himself. The scent of town, wood smoke, charcoal smoke, and the aroma of a packed mass of humanity reached them well before the sight of the city itself. The town in Maine was well made, and made of stone. There was plenty of such material hereabouts. As with all walled towns, buildings of various sorts had sprung up outside the walls to accommodate the increased population. As Quedrum came up the road, city guards were forcibly removing one shelter that had been set up on the road itself. The husband was standing by, with a guard's spear at his throat to keep him quiet. The wife was screeching incoherently at the guards who went about their business, ignoring her. The captain of the party, gruff but not rude, said, "Come, mother, you know the law. No building may block any street or road. We asked you once to move 4 feet over. We come back and you've made no attempt to move. So we do what we have to do." Quedrum frowned. Why did they put their house there in the first place? He muttered to Shapakalish. Did they think the town would let them be? You don't pick a fight you can't win. Impossible to say why. Sometimes when you have so little to lose, just picking a smooth spot for your tent, even for the time being, knowing you'll be evicted, seems worthwhile. Or perhaps there was no thought at all, just setting up the tent, no consideration for either permissions or disallowances. The city proper was more solidly built. Most of the buildings were made of stone and mortar. One could tell the houses were more affluent. The stones were squared and fitted perfectly. At last they'd come to the marketplace. Shapakalish turned to Quedrum. You're certain you don't wish to stay with me? No, I think not. Then he thought to himself, and don't pretend you aren't glad to see the last of me. But we haven't seen the last of each other, Shapakalish carried on. We still have some unfinished business. Have we indeed, little merchant? He thought to himself. Quedrum went looking for a buyer for the last 2 rabbits. He sold both of them to a woman of middle years, a woman of the town, and got 2 coppers better than he might have, on the ground that the skins were whole and unmarked. He put these coppers together with a bit of his own money and then bought a few items. He then sat in the marketplace and put together 2 talismans of fire starting. He concentrated on speed, not quality, and the 2 talismans he produced would work well, though not for an extended length of time. He chose his first customer with care, a caravan master wearing a dark leather vest and trousers, with a turban around his head to keep off the sun. "Sir, do you wish to buy a fire-starting talisman? Very useful for those times when you need a fire, and quickly." The fellow spoke the common language, but with an accent Quadroon couldn't quite place. "This has some advantage over flint and steel?" "Yes, indeed. With this, there is no concern about having tinder kept safely dry at all times. You simply take a twig, like so, hold it in your hand, while holding the talisman in the other. You then say, 'Fire!' And behold, the twig burns." "I see. And what do you ask for this thing?" Quadroon stubbed out the burning stick on the dirt of the marketplace. 2 silver coins." 2 silvers? Ridiculous! 2 coppers. "For 2 coppers I will tear the things to shreds first. I must at least recoup the cost of the material. 1 silver and 5 coppers. They finally made the bargain at 1 silver and 2 coppers. A little better than Quadroon had actually expected. The next customer was a mercenary soldier, a light spearman, wearing a leather cuirass. Cuirass? I can't pronounce that. That's a me thing, not a misspelling. Having only ever read it. The bane of many readers. The next customer was a mercenary soldier, a light spearman wearing a leather cuirass and carrying a much-used shield. He bargained harder and brought the price down to 1 silver. Quadroon considered this fine. The fire starters he made would work, and work well, but only for a time, after which they would cease to work altogether. That would not be for a month or 2, though, at which time he hoped both customers would be too far away to bring back any complaint. With a little more money in hand, Quadroon went off to find a wine shop. He wanted a wine shop of a certain quality. Not the best, but certainly not a dive. His main requirements were that there be people, and people who might be separated from their money. A certain establishment, named the Copper Bowl, seemed like a likely bet, and continued to seem so when he stepped inside. At one table sat 4 men, strongly built, probably small farmers, squat and solid, with hair varying from a bushy black mop to a balding crown to a hairless head that gleamed faintly with sweat. He bought a cup of wine and carried it to the table. "May I join you, gentlemen?" Politeness and courtesy were not necessarily the signs of weakness some considered them to be. In certain situations, they were essential tools. The 4 looked up at him with unwelcoming faces. Quadroon maintained a smile, not the sort of broad smile that made people wonder what was behind it, but just a general good-humored expression. My name's Quadroon. I've just arrived in town today, and I like to hear the latest news. Don't want to run afoul of the wrong people. Do you mind if I join you?" One of them finally shrugged, hitched his stool over. Taking this for as effusive a welcome as he could expect at this table, Quadroon reached back with a foot and hooked a stool over from another table, then sat down. "What'd you want to know?" said the bald man brusquely. "Just about anything and everything, I guess. Until a while ago, I'd scarcely heard of your city. Now here I am. Is this a good or bad time to be here? No pestilence or war breaking out, I hope." The bald man frowned. "Might not be the best time to be here. War's coming on." "That's not good. Who's troubling who?" "The Carmista of this province. She's being pressed. The Carmost of Dora? He's determined to take over Higfrud. Up until last year, he couldn't do much because of our Carmista, the lady Anna Veristi. She's related to the kings of Davalash. Last year the old king died, and there was some fuss over who should take over the crown. That meant Balatus of Dora had a chance. First he suggested marriage, agreeing to give up his present wife, but Lady Anniversary, she'd have none of it. So now he's giving out that he's mortally insulted and demands surrender or war. Quadrim nodded. They go to war, and we underneath try to keep our heads down. From the expressions, that was not quite the thing to say. He had fallen in with a band of patriots? He was trying to come up with something to ameliorate the effect of his latest statement when the bushy-haired one said, "You might find yourself recruited for her army. Or are you any good with that sling at your belt?" "Well, old woman, give you grace for that. Saves me the trouble of having to work around to it casually." "Best you're likely to see." A brag seemed the best way to handle this lot. "That good? But of course, you wouldn't claim to be second best, would you?" The others just nodded, grinning, letting young bushy hair carry the conversation. There's no difficulty at all to play insulted. It was no difficulty at all to play insulted. "I'll bet you 3 silvers I can hit a target of the size of a man's head at 50 paces, 3 times in 5. "Aha! Got you now." "Oh, for sure. Everyone's heard of the Kedrim the Deadly. From here to Saragos. And you've never been more than a day's trip from your farm, have you?" "It's not Kedrim, it's Quedrim. And if you haven't got the money to put up to watch me, then stop gabbling. Here's mine." He slapped a silver coin on the table, glancing at the profile of the woman shown on it. "She's got a big nose, hasn't she?" Ignoring his friend's protest, the young man put a coin on the table himself. "There you are, now show us." Quadrim leaned back. "This isn't my town. You find a target and a place to set up, then find me. I'll be here." He looked at the bald man. "When he's got things set up, you'll hold all the bets?" The bald man looked at him closely. "All right." No one spoke of any further of warning, but Quadrim knew he was in a tricky situation. These fellows might not take kindly to him taking advantage of their younger friend. Well, there would be nothing they could prove about it, one way or another. He'd just have to keep his eyes open in case someone decided on their own that the stranger had been cheating somehow. The young farmer, Thaldo by name, had picked a spot on a hillside. Quadrim wasn't sure if he'd picked that spot to make things a bit more difficult for Quadrim, or perhaps because there was a little flat land thereabouts. The target, on the other hand, was perhaps a little larger than an average man's head, and not likely large enough to make a significant difference. Quadrim was happy to see a small group, no great crowd, but sufficient for the moment, had gathered to watch. He checked over the field the young farmer had picked, studying the ground as though that mattered. One could, of course, whip 3 stones in a row into the target, but that might suggest to Thaldo's friends that the young man had been set up for a fall. He made a show of carefully picking a stone from his pouch. All that mattered was that he picked one of his special stones. He tested his footing. This mattered a little. Rolling a pebble or the like underfoot at the wrong moment might just put his shot off. He swung the sling 3 times around his head and let go. The stone leaped out so fast as to be lost from sight, then smacked into the target and bounced away. Ignoring the crowd's murmurs, he picked up another stone, and sent it too, whipping down the range. It hit, of course. They murmured louder now. He chose another stone and slung it at the range, missing by a hand's breadth. More murmuring. Now another choice. Finish it fast and have Thaldo's friends thinking he had taken advantage of the young man, or another miss, then a final hit, and risk seeming to be having fun at Thaldo's expense. He thought he had read the crowd's reactions right. His next shot hit home. The only problem might be if they thought he was using some kind of magic, of course. Doing this trick too often gave a fellow a bad name. And he'd had magicians called in before a time or two at the fellow's expense, and they could never find a trace of magic involved. Indeed, they might decide to mob him on the grounds he'd used magic, proven or no. He was ready for that. The fact was, he could make about any shot he wanted with his special stones, occasionally at ranges bordering on the fantastic. And who could fault him for using that fact to make money on? He turned to Thaldo, staying aware all the time in case people were moving in behind him. You satisfied? One had to watch one's expression, too, especially in a strange town. Say something that sounded like you were rubbing it in. That might bring payback from Thaldo's friends, and Thaldo himself if it came to that. Thaldo handed over the money, frowning. You are good. Good enough to find yourself recruited, willing or no, for the ladies' army. Not me. I was in an army once, got my leg bashed up. No more armies for me. I can use a sling, but I'm not much good on long marches. Huh. That statement seemed to have lowered him in Thaldo's judgment. Old woman's apron. Why should I involve myself in someone else's war? And if it becomes needful, I put aside my talisman against lameness. No army's going to buy a talisman just to keep one slinger on his feet. He spoke aloud. Would you like to get some of your money back? The young fellow sneered. Bet against you again? What kind of fool do I look like? Old woman's apron. No, I meant you set up another match. This time you lay bets with people in the crowd, betting on me to win. You maybe lose your original bet, but you make money anyhow. Then we split 50-50. I won't even insist you pay back my silver. He watched Thaldo as the young man considered. Come on, you didn't lose all your money today. I saw you laying side bets on my third and fourth shots. Thaldo smiled, and it did not surprise Quedrim to see a shamefaced look. All right. Suppose I set up another match. You want me to do it right now? No. Work on getting bets in overnight. Meet me at the same place tomorrow, the wine shop we met in. All right, just don't get yourself so drunk you can't see the target, let alone hit it. The youngster had just had to get a little dig in, make himself feel better. You just see to your part, I'll see to mine. In fact, Quedrim didn't do too much drinking at all. He did a little cautious gambling, but luck wasn't with him, and he knew better than to keep playing, hoping his luck would change. One sure bet, he thought wryly, is that it won't. He did find a quiet corner to practice having his special stone unwatched. He'd already had some notions as to what sort of game he might use them in. Next day, he put some more money into material and put together another talisman, a water finder, and he sold it to a farmer. You'll never regret this, he told the man. No more digging wells and hope that there's something at the bottom. Now you'll know where there's water. This talisman was of better quality than the ones he'd made the previous day. The fellow would get at least a year's use out of it. How often would a farmer use it? Get out to his farm, find a new spot for a well, maybe rent it out to a neighbor or two. Then the thing would probably sit on a shelf for a few years. It might be only the farmer's son or grandson who noticed the talisman wasn't working any longer. Though the farmer had been a sharp bargainer in the end, Quedrim increased his stock of coin a bit. He knew well enough that the sling hustle would only work until the word got around, and in a small place like this, it wouldn't be more than a few days. He knew he'd have to find something else to do. Gambling was no sure thing, unless you had some means to bend the odds your way a bit. Even then, people noticed you were too lucky, avoided playing with you, or they caught you doing something that went against the rules, and that made bigger problems. As if any one of them couldn't do the same, or worse, if they thought they could get away with it. Higford wasn't a large city. He should be able to last for a year doing this or that game. Then he'd probably have to move on. Which brought to mind another fact. Thanks to Shopakalish and his hidden ways, Quedrim didn't know exactly where the nearest city was. He'd have to work that out, though there's plenty of time. It would be nice if he could make a good score now, take some rich fool for a lot. He shook his head. Mess around with rich people? They can make bad trouble for you. Often as not, they had contacts in other cities, people who owed them a favor or two. The likes of Quedrim didn't have any allies at all. It was him against the world against him, and he just had to watch who he skinned and how badly. Thaldo was already at the wine shop when Quedrim showed up. The young farmer grinned at him. Old woman's apron, man. Why don't you just hire someone to go around announcing we're in this together? None of Thaldo's friends from the previous day were with him. Maybe he hadn't told them. Or maybe they hadn't wanted to find themselves involved in something that might be shady. So, Quedrim, you ready? He shrugged. Ready. Thaldo had set up the target in the same place, and this time the crowd was a bit bigger. Among the crowd were other farmers and other folk who looked like the sort to bet it on anything. There was even a robed Condolini among them. Very far from home, that one. Quedrim varied his techniques this time. Hit the first one, missed the second one, then hit the third and fourth. From the sound of the crowd, a lot of people had bet against him. That fool Thaldo, grinning broadly, came up to him with a handful of silver. Not here, whispered Quedrim sharply. Back at the wine shop. The boy's face fell. Well, so his feelings were hurt. Better some hurt feelings than a beating, or worse, from a crowd who'd lost their money. Back at the wine shop, Thaldo pushed the money across the table with a sulky look on his face. Quedrim didn't so much take pity on him as decide to teach him some facts. After all, the two of them might work together for a bit more. Look, boy, you don't wave fistful of silver in front of a bunch of people you've just skinned. In this case, handing me a bunch of money just tells them they've been had. They've been talked into a sucker bet, and the two of us have worked this out between us. But we had. Yes, and some people having it rubbed in their faces can get downright nasty. You collect your winnings with a smile, but not a big, mile-wide grin. You share the loot later on, quietly. You sound as though we're going to do this again. Quedrim shrugged. We can. Depends on a lot of things. I think it'd be best to lay off the sling game for a few days. We can do the same thing too many days in a row. We do the same thing too many days in a row. Word gets around faster. Nobody will bet against us. Not only that, we'll get the name for running a game. And the watch will be on our heads. And have the watch on our heads, or whatever they have in these parts to keep order. Besides, don't you have to be back at the farm? Thaldo looked up. No, not me. My brother Goldat is going to take on the farm. As for me, I'm going to join the ladies' army. Quedrim barely managed to keep himself from saying something like, "Old woman's apron, what for?" But he remembered in time the young fellow's expression when he, Quedrim, had made his pronouncement on armies the day before. He restrained himself to merely saying, "Oh?" Thaldo kept the conversation going. "I'd say it's only polite I offer to buy you a cup of wine." So they sat for a while, Quedrim trading stories of faraway and exotic lands for chit-chat on the ins and outs of life hereabouts. Quedrim had spent the odd moment hoping Shopakalish would be eaten by Morkur Deathlord for bringing him here. He would have to find out, and quickly, what direction he ought to go. He disliked being in a city on what looked to be the losing side of a prospective war. That meant the possibility of a siege, and worse yet, sacking. Neither of them things to be desired. Which is most likely why he decided to start on his new game. "Listen," he told Thaldo. "You start off betting against me. Then, when we get some people over here looking on you, you start making some side bets on me. And don't worry, no matter how mad it sounds, I'll win. Baldo seemed to be still taking in this sudden change of subject when Quadrum reached into his pouch and took out one of his special stones. See this? I set it on the table here like so. Now, without touching the stone or the table by any means, I can make that stone leap from here to the table's edge. Nonsense! Baldo didn't have to work at all to sound skeptical. All the better, as long as he remembered his part, lay off some side bets. Nonsense, is it? Look, here's 5 coppers. Cover that. It was a small bet, but it was a start. Baldo was staring at him. Come on, boy. You're quick to say nonsense, but slow to put your money out. Of course. That pushed the boy just far enough. All right, here's 5. Show me. Which was fine as far as it went. If the boy had a bit of sense, he'd have started getting people in already. Well, Quadrum could do that himself, though it put everything on him and made him the sole target if things turned nasty. He looked around. Anyone else want to get in? Eyes were turning in their direction, eyes that showed varying states of intoxication. I'm betting, without touching the stone or the table, I can make that stone jump to the far edge of the table. I've got 5 coppers out now. Anyone else want to get in? A husky blonde fellow, what country does that pale hair come from, walked over the table in the careful way to common drunks and slapped down a silver coin. No strings? No strings. Quadrum pulled out a coin to match, noticing idly that the blonde man's coin showed the picture of some strange ruler with a foreign inscription. Anybody else? Come on. This is hardly worth the money. After a little more coaxing, he had nearly a reasonable sum of money out in front of him. Quadrum stood and moved back from the table so they could see he wasn't touching it. Anybody want to check for strings? Someone was actually sober enough to take that to measure. He moved his hands all around and over the table and certified it free from strings or wires. Quadrum looked at the stone, fastened it in his mind, and said, "Stone, jump to the edge of the table." The stone jumped and landed just short of the table's edge. There was some muttering, a bit of it bad-tempered. "Some kind of trick," someone shouted. "Well, of course it's some kind of trick. But it's a trick I know how to do. Want me to show you again? Put up some money." The blond man said, "Right, I'll put up some money, but this time I get to hold your hands." "Hold my hands, hold my feet, hold anything you want. I just have to be able to see the stone and talk to it." This brought some new bets, and at last they were ready. The blond man took a hold of Quadrum's hands in his own pair of strong, calloused hands. "Go ahead." The stone had been placed, not exactly where it had started, but nearer to a quarter way around the table. "Jump to the edge of the table, stone." The stone jumped. Once more, some of the crowd shouted. The blond man let go of Quadrum's hand, spun him around by the shoulder. Quadrum's leg, talisman or no, betrayed him momentarily in the twisting motion, and he stumbled. The yellow hair's rough hand caught him by the front of his tunic. "You'll tell me now you did that." "I'll tell you how I did that. You'll be winning bets instead of me." This was a bad part. How drunk, how angry was Yellow Hair? Was he ready to be influenced by argument or sense? No, he was bringing up a fist. Quadrum had not so much to drink, though, and as a boy he had learned a lot of wrestling tricks in the Arundel Hills. He slapped a hand on the fist, holding his tunic, lifted and twisted, forcing Yellow Hair to turn away from the pain. Slapping his other hand on the man's elbow, Quadrum sent him flying at the wall. Quadrum immediately began scooping up money from the table into his wide-brimmed hat. A few coppers and silvers slipped away, tumbling to the floor. He didn't bother with those. The fight was beginning. And mostly it was a case of anybody hitting everyone else. He wanted no part of that. He saw Thaldo hanging onto a handful of money in his shirt front with one hand while warding off a couple of semi-drunk attackers with the other. Quadrum hit one of them behind the ear with his cane, stuck a foot out behind the other's knee and pushed him down. Come on, boy, let's get out of here. And watch out. At its start, the fight had been over the bet. But in a flash, it turned into a wild any against all affray. He shouldn't have made the second bet. Pleaded tiredness or something. Not his fault people were so edgy here. Quadrum knew very well that his best position, when the watch came to deal with the matter, would be seated comfortably in a wine shop some distance from the center of the trouble. It required some skillful use of his stick, as well as his knees and feet, to get to the door. Luckily, Thaldo appeared to have the sense to follow him. Once out the door and a few steps away, he slowed down. Hold up, Thaldo. Running away will just get people's attention. You know a place they won't cheat us for a night's lodgings? Yes, follow me. And thanks for getting me out of that business. Huh? You're hanging on to money I have a share in. Otherwise, I'd have let you get your head bashed in. Right. The boy didn't believe him. Well, if he lived long enough, he'd see that everybody was out for themselves. Most likely, he'd die first. He spent most of the next morning buying material and putting together talismans in the markets. He thought that considering last night's excitement, he'd be best to stick to talismans. Talismans cost more in time and money to make, but most times he could manage it so the fellow who bought the talisman didn't come back with a band of friends, a bunch of clubs, and a bad mood. This time he intended to make some fire starters, a couple water finders, and a talisman against lameness. While he was sitting there in the market, there was a sudden stir as a column of mounted soldiers rode through. From the chatter he gathered this was the Carmista. He glanced up. It was always good to know the faces of the powerful, if only to avoid coming into their sight. His first thought was there was a die cutter somewhere who deserved to be whipped. She didn't have a big nose. Strong, yes. High, yes. But not that great honker pictured on the coins. Other things struck him. She wore armor and a sword, and the sword was not one of those decorated, bejeweled monsters useless in a fight. It was a warrior's tool, made for her size and weight, and meant for use. Poor girl, he thought. Even here in the midst of the people who say they love her, she knows she's not safe. For some reason, it didn't feel as good as usual to have his view of the world confirmed. Everyone was looking after themselves. Some good people got squashed while that was happening. The column stopped. This wasn't some ordinary procession. They were here for a purpose. A part of the column moved around the Carmista and her immediate guard, and people drew back to allow them room. In the midst of this group was a tall and powerfully built fellow, whose clothing declared him to be one of the upper class. He looked and carried himself like a lord, though he wasn't wearing any armor or weapons, and his hands were bound behind him. Some of the escort got down, pulled him free from the saddle, though they didn't let him sprawl on the cobbles of the marketplace. That was the only consideration they gave him, for they roughly pushed him into a kneeling position. The herald spoke, trained voice carrying to all corners of the square. People of Higfrud, this man, Holkas, son of Vodathar, has betrayed Lady Anavristi of Higfrud. Not being content with spreading malicious lies against her, he has even gone so far as to attempt the formation of a cabal to overthrow her. Though the lady's generosity and mercy are great, certain things cannot be forgiven. For this cause, it is decreed that he should be executed here, and his head displayed for a sign of the Carmista's justice. A soldier, an ordinary cavalry trooper, though somewhat stronger in the arms than the most, stepped forward, drew a sword, and in one strong, clean blow cut the head from the guilty lord. They left the body there to lie there in the street, though Quidrim supposed that eventually a crew would come along to dispose of it, likely tossing it into a dung heap. They took the head with them, in a basket brought for the purpose. It seemed to Quidrim that the lady was not going to go down easily, but he wondered how much use his execution would be. It was good that she had the strength of will to order such things, but how many other lords were going to be looking at the comparative sizes of her forces and the enemies that and at least consider a separate bargain with him? Everyone looked out for themselves, after all. The column moved on out of his sight, and he went on with his work. It seemed to Quidrim a good sign that one of the people who paused to watch him work leaned again on a cane and limped in the manner of one who had had the joint pain. "Ha! Uncle, I have just the thing for you." Old eyes looked at him, hostile at being hailed by a foreigner, a hostility further fueled by continual pain. "And what is it you imagine I need?" "Look at this." He rolled back his trouser leg to show the wreck that was his left knee. "I went to the wars as a young man. I took a sling stone on the left knee that ended my career. And you can believe I was lame and in pain too. And then I discovered the making of this." He held up the talisman against lameness. "You see, I wear one as well." He still wore his own, as well as the thing Stonecaller had given him. Sometime he'd have to remake his talisman, if that were possible, though for now the little man's talisman was doing well. The old man frowned. "Oh, yes, and its cost is equally astounding, I suppose." "Now, Uncle, you wrong me. If you go shopping for a ham, the best ham always costs a bit. All I ask is 3 silver coins, and you'll be free of pain for half a year." 3? Ridiculous! Did I accidentally come out of the house today with "fool" written across my forehead? Suppose I pay you a copper for that thing and find that it doesn't work. I'd be willing to bet you'd be nowhere around, would you? With such an attitude, do you ever buy anything? Look! Quidrim demonstrated one of his fire starter talismans. "See, these work just as advertised, and I guarantee the talisman against lameness will work as well." "Oh, and how?" "I'd be willing to bet you'll tell me I have to wait a day or more for the full effect. By that time, where would you be? Halfway to Chol, I suppose." Quidrim shrugged. "You're right. Something like this takes a little time to work, and nothing I could do or say will convince you it does work. So off you go, save your money, and rejoice as you limp about for the next year that you have your money, and having that money in your fist is worth all the pain." The old stir's face became even more forbidding. "I would surely not pay 3 silvers for it." "1, perhaps." "Got you, did I? One does not begin to pay what I put into it. 2 silver and 5 coppers. The price ended up at 2 silver and 1. With a lame talisman, Quidrim always gave a warning. It should last for at least 4, possibly as long as 8 months. If it does not, come back to me. The truth was, they seldom lasted longer than 3 months, but by that time, Quidrim should be somewhere else. And if by chance a dissatisfied customer should find him, he'd be all apologetic about the magic's advantageous nature and offer cut rate on a replacement. Strangely, he found his mind drifting back to the Carmista from time to time during the day. At these times, he considered this the way of the world. Everyone was out for themselves. From all he'd heard about the situation, she was about to fall. Hard. Those eyes would be staring out over that proud nose from atop of a pike. And wasn't that a shame? He shook his head. And wasn't it a shame Quidrim had to keep his mind on his work or he'd starve? He didn't do anything big for the next few days. He developed another game involving his stones, in which he'd take 2 special stones, balance one on the other, muttering, "Stay there." Then he'd bet a few coppers that no one else could do it. He kept the stakes low. A few coppers is not really a big win, but they added up. This one looked more like a magic matter of steady hands than something halfway to magic. Mostly he'd been too smart to press his luck He'd been too smart to press his luck too far. The last few days were an exception. He'd pushed his luck too far and too fast, getting into the big stakes about where the chances were high that someone was going to be upset about the amount they had lost. Despite all efforts to lie low, on his third night working this new game, he suddenly saw a blonde head pushing its way across the room. A second glance told Quedrum, yes, it was that bad-tempered yellow hair, and he was a little more sober this evening. He plainly recognized Quedrum, for he was surging this way determinedly. Quedrum didn't want another riot tonight. He scooped a handful of coppers from the table, tossed them in a scatter in the blonde's path. Have a good time on me, lads. He scooped the rest, as much as he could, into his hat and his shirt front, and made his way out the side door to the alley. The alley, of course, had been used as a latrine for generations by the wine shop's patron, and it stank badly. But Quedrum wasn't paying particular heed to that. His concern was more whether Yellowhair was drunk enough to determine to follow him, or sober enough to realize that if he went back out front and circled around the alley, he might meet Quedrum in the alley's mouth. In this case, he apparently hadn't thought that clearly. Quedrum headed off through the darkened streets. By now he knew several places where he could stay. And even without the coppers he'd scattered or hadn't been able to grab on the table, he was adequately in funds to be able to pay for his lodging. He even had several talismans he hadn't yet sold. His mood was still bad. Why did Yellowhair and his old grudges have to come along tonight? When you were gaming for coppers, you couldn't afford to let any get away. And what did he let what, 20 get away? Worse waited him the next day. He was leaning against a wall in the marketplace, with his talismans on display, idly juggling one of the special stones, causing it to leap from palm to fingertips and back again. It was a fine afternoon, and he was enjoying the heat on his chest, though his hat kept his face shaded. Once more the Carmista and her party rode through. Nearly everyone stopped what they were doing to watch, and called greetings to her. It occurred to Quedrum to feel sorry for the woman. She rode so bravely through the marketplace, fully armed and armored against whoever or whatever might attack. Yet she acted as though there was little to worry about. Did she actually think she could survive? She must have her doubts, for there was an archer there on the rooftop, watching on the crowd. A moment later, several things occurred to him. Only the one archer was in sight, and the man was not exactly standing where he could watch the crowd. He seemed to be skulking up there, trying to remain hidden. Then he realized this was no guard. This was an assassin, looking for the best shot. Without hardly thinking about it, Quedrum whipped his sling from his belt, dropped the stone into it, and began whirling it around his head. The assassin was standing, drawing his bow. Quedrum let loose his stone. It was a far shot, but not that far, especially not for one of his special stones. The man went back and down, but he already loosed an arrow and was reaching for another when he fell. The marketplace crowd broke into shouting and screaming, confusion in the lady's party. Was she down? Suddenly someone was pointing at Quedrum, standing there like a fool with a sling dangling from his hand. They had surged forward to get close to the Carmenista. Now they were beginning to surge his way. It only took an instant for him to realize what was happening. He whirled and ran. The crowd came after him. He rushed through the streets, up the alleyways, but the noise of the crowd told him they were still behind him. Then, without warning, he was in a blind alley with nowhere further to flee. Old woman's apron! He hadn't been in the city long enough to get to know all its ins and outs, and here he was, trapped. The crowd continued to press toward him, and behind he saw horsemen. Not only were the citizens after him, but the Carmista's bodyguard as well. Why hadn't he let well enough alone? saving the Carmista's life like some stupid hero. This is what it got him, torn to pieces by a mob. The crowd swarmed toward him, screaming their fury, and the horsemen back continued to push their way forward. Ah, wonderful. He would be pummeled to death under authorities' watchful and approving eyes. He tried one door in desperation, locked of course, and was much too solid to break in. He rushed to the next door, but before he reached it, heavy hands grasped him, and fists pounded on his back. He fell, and kicking began. Something hit his head, and battering further blows drifted away into darkness. What happens next? We don't know until tomorrow. So, yeah, I think these ones are a little bit longer than the other chapters, but I like them so far. But yeah, I'll be back again tomorrow night with another chapter. So I will talk to you then. Have a good night. Oh, by the way, I'm also sorry about the sounds, the ambient background sounds. I'll try to make that quieter tomorrow night. Anyway, good night.